to use the language that the presiding officer would use to get rid of a quorum call. And I'd ask unanimous consent of the presiding officer to set aside the pending amendment, so I may offer my amendment number 90, that there be up to 15 minutes for debate on the amendment, and that upon the use or yielding back of time, the Senate vote on the amendment without further intervening action or debate.
Is there any objection? Mr. President. The senator from Alabama.
Reserving my right to object. Mr. President, the Laken Riley Act is a targeted, common-sense, life-saving bill. This legislation adds crimes to the mandatory detention provisions of the INA and uses the existing framework of the INA. What this amendment would do is introduce new carve-outs that don't already exist. Mr. President, we have a crisis in this nation. Our border has been overrun, and every city across this country is paying the price. Today, we return to common sense. We return to practicality. If you come here illegally and you commit a crime, you should not be free to roam the streets of this nation. Our children deserve better, and that's exactly what we're giving them today. My colleague from Colorado speaks of DACA. Mr. President, of the 537,000 DACA recipients in this nation, there is not one that is under the age of 17. And in fact, Mr. President, of the 537,000 recipients, there are only 1,000 between the ages of 17 and 20. When you're talking about other minors across this nation, some of which who may be here illegally, we are seeing the cost to them right now. Look no further than what's happening in New York. We have teen migrant gangs running rampant, where you have minors as young as 11 being involved in the theft and burglary rings. Mr. President, what do you think you do if you carve out a certain set of minors? Do you think you make them more safe from the people looking to do them harm? Do you think the drug cartels all of a sudden say, hey, I'm going to leave them alone? No, Mr. President, that's not what happens. What happens, Mr. President, is each and every one of those kids becomes a greater target. They become more vulnerable to become a mule to do the work of the drug cartels and the human traffickers. Mr. President, again, now is the time to return to common sense. Now is the time to return to law and order. We are a proud nation of immigrants. We are also a nation of laws, and the lawlessness ends today. I could not be more proud of those that are choosing today to support the Laken Riley Act, because what we've done is we've decided we're going to stop talking and we're going to start achieving results. We are looking for targeted reforms. They're going to keep Americans safe and secure. It's exactly what the Laken Riley Act does. It honors Laken's life and legacy, a beautiful life and legacy. As her mother, Allison, and her stepfather, John Phillips, have said, she brought warmth to everyone who knew her, that she lit up every room, that she found ways to show kindness and her faith and her love for the Lord. Today we honor Laken, and we ensure that with this common sense approach, Mr. President, targeted, making sure that our communities are safe and secure, that no other family has to go through the heartbreak that Laken's did. So, Mr. President, ultimately, I have to say no to this amendment, and therefore I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the senator from Alabama for her work on the Senate floor and for coming over. I know this is a big day around the Senate, Mr. President. It's a big day for America, and it's appropriate, I think, that we should be here on this issue today, because over the coming months and years, we are going to be confronting a lot of choices to make. And I think it's critically important that as we make these choices, we do it in a way that is consistent with our values. Mr. President, throughout our history, generations of Americans have tried to secure our heritage as a nation of immigrants and a nation committed to the rule of law. Both of those are important. And when we've fallen short, which we have from time to time, we have battled back to reclaim these moral values. Our enduring commitment to this imperfect but principled work is why 21st century America has one of the most dynamic economies, vibrant cultures, and an important reputation throughout the world as a beacon of freedom. That reputation, by the way, is not assured. That is a reputation that has to be earned by our nation every single day, Mr. President. Although our founders were famously suspicious of overreaching by the federal government, they recognized the obvious national imperative, the national security and foreign policy imperatives, and the problems that would arise if every state and county and city, Mr. President, were to enforce its own immigration laws. And that's why the Constitution of the United States says that the Congress, working with the President, should administer those laws. And they therefore logically assign the responsibility to our national government, not to our state government, not to our local government, to enforce our immigration law. Throughout our history, the American people have been welcoming to new immigrants, and sometimes less so. Understandably, chaotic and changing circumstances like the ones we face today sometimes raise alarms among the American people. Unfortunately, in our time, and I would agree with the senator from Alabama on this, we have not addressed the chaos at the southern border of the United States. And politicians have used this crisis for years to divide the American people on one side of the partisan divide and as another. And as a result, the failing immigration system that we have has only become more broken. The thing that I want to make sure of is that as we think about the chaos that we're facing, the complexity that we're facing, is that we don't, as we have occasionally in the past, abandon our values and our commitment to the rule of law. In more inspired times, we've used these crises to actually burnish our great global advantage as a nation of immigrants that's committed to the rule of law. In 2013, Mr. President, we had what was, in my view, an important chance to embrace those values with the Senate's work on the Gang of Eight. The senator from Alabama might remember, to her, that seems like ancient history. I was one of the members of the Gang of Eight. I was a lot younger than I am today, and so were the other members of that gang, too. But we seriously tried to take on meaningful immigration reform in this chamber. We had a tough but fair pathway to citizenship for those who could earn it in the United States. We included the DREAM Act. We had a massive overhaul of our visa system so our farms and ranches and high-tech industries, even our ski industry, could continue to compete with the rest of the world. We had $46 billion of border security money in there. I hate to think, Mr. President, what that money was in real dollars today, what that $46 billion would look like today. I bet you it's around $60 billion that 68 people in this chamber agreed to support together. There was so much money in that bill that Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham from South Carolina, who is another member of the Gang of Eight, used to say that there were going to be so many Border Patrol agents that they could literally hold hands from one end of the border to the other across the United States of America. I can see that the senator from Alabama has heard that story before. There has been a huge cost of inaction, not just the money that, if we had spent it then, would have made such a huge difference, but the painful consequences the senator from Alabama and others have talked about, I have talked about, for the American people and for our country. In the end, after months of going through the legislative ringer, as I mentioned, we got 68 votes over here in the Senate. If it had been given a chance, read Speaker Boehner's book, he'll tell you this. If it had gone to the floor, it would have gotten a majority vote on the floor of the Senate. But the Freedom Caucus killed that bill, Mr. President, in a legislative back alley before it could see the light of day on the House floor. And since then, like with so many of the American people's most fundamental concerns, the federal government and this Congress has been immobilized on the subject of immigration, for sure, under both Republican and Democratic presidents. In the meantime, transnational gangs have seized full opportunity of our inaction, raking in billions of dollars, smuggling human beings and drugs and weapons to the southern border of the United States. These criminal syndicates have perfected their worldwide smuggling operations. They've trained people how to exploit our asylum system, and they have weaponized social media to enable thousands of people to travel all over the globe to present themselves at the southern border of the United States or to come through the southern border. And the result of that paralysis has been, at times, an overwhelmed southern border. For this reason, in 2022, I urge the Biden administration never to lift Title 42 without a plan and without the resources to execute it. They were unprepared for what was to come, and they were too slow to act. It's clear to almost everybody today that our system isn't built for today's conditions. We need to fix it, and we need to give the American people confidence that we have a fair and secure system in place. So how do we do that? Well, tonight, Mr. President, we're going to vote on the first response from the Congress, the Laken Riley Act, which I think is neither focused on driving resources to the border or establishing a more robust and rigorous system of immigration. Instead, contrary to our constitutional obligations, today's bill devolves authority away from the President and Congress to 50 state attorneys general. In ways that seem extremely counterproductive to me, I hope I'm not right about this, although you can already see a battle brewing in the administration about this. This bill provides state attorney generals the power to seek nationwide injunctions to completely block certain countries like India and China, El Salvador, from sending immigrants here. Imagine a Salvadorian farm worker on an H-2A visa living in Florida or Louisiana or committing a violent crime, leading to a deportation order. He should be deported. I'm not here to dispute that. I don't dispute that. But with this bill, if El Salvador doesn't accept his deportation, Florida's Attorney General could ask a court to force the federal government to ban all visas from El Salvador, or all H-2A visas, or all H-1B visas for high-tech workers, for all that matters. Nearly 5,500 people in Colorado today are working on an H-2A visa. Why should Florida's Attorney General be able to dictate Colorado's need for these workers? Why should any state attorney general be able to hammer the economies of 49 other states? It doesn't make any sense. It's because Congress and the administration have abandoned their responsibility here. We find ourselves in this position. Second, this bill creates mandatory detention policies for immigrants accused of committing nonviolent and also violent crime. And as I said, I believe we should be going after transnational gangs, street gangs, and people who pose a threat to our communities. When a brutal crime is committed, as in the case of Laken Riley, we should respond. We have to respond. And we should stand with her family, as the senator from Alabama has done, and her community, and ensure that something like that never happens again. But in my opinion, this bill is not targeted enough. It would force ICE, working with local law enforcement, to detain immigrants who are accused, not just convicted, but accused of a very broad set of crimes, including shoplifting, without regard to how young they are or more important, whether they're a threat to our community or a threat to public safety. There is a good reason, and I know the presiding officer may not agree with this, but I know he knows the logic. There is a good reason why we seldom pass legislation with mandatory detention or jailing. We tend to believe that law enforcement is in the best position to determine in real time who the threat to public safety actually is. And we know we don't have the resources, we never have the resources to lock up every nonviolent offender without regard to whether they're a threat to public safety or not. I know this sounds crazy, but this bill is so broadly drafted that it would compel law enforcement to put a mandatory detention on you heard it, an 11-year-old immigrant in New York accused of stealing a soda from a gas station. I think most law enforcement agents across the country would tell you that their time would be much better spent tracking down and detaining, for example, a violent criminal who's bludgeoned their neighbor with a hammer. But this bill doesn't distinguish between those two cases. Instead, it strips law enforcement of their ability to make their best judgment about whom to arrest and not to arrest, whom to detain and not detain, and how to focus their precious resources on protecting our public safety. The proponents of this bill do not deny that children will be swept up in its administration. This is not a drafting error, Mr. President. In this bill, every undocumented person accused, not just convicted, but accused of a list of crimes that's in this bill must be detained. That might sound like law and order, Mr. President, but it's easy to see how this encroachment on law enforcement's ability to do its job could spiral out of control. To make matters even worse, this bill does not provide ICE with the resources it needs to implement what is now a massive unfunded liability. And I know that the proponents of the bill say they're going to fix that problem, but just so you understand, ICE says this bill is going to cost $27 billion a year. That's their number. I've heard much higher numbers than that. Let's take their number. $27 billion a year. That is 3 times ICE's annual budget of $9 billion. Many of us are used to, Mr. President, used to Congress passing bills without ever paying for them, but this may be one of the worst cases that we've seen. And I know there may be an attempt here through reconciliation, a tax measure to try to fund this in some way or to pick some other place to do it. But choices are going to have to be made between the mandatory detention of people who may not be a threat to our community and other choices like the funding for Border Patrol or the countering of weapons of the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office at Homeland Security, the Disaster Relief Fund, just 3 that come to mind. Put another way, every dollar that ICE spends incarcerating kids is a dollar the Border Patrol doesn't have to spend on the border itself. Wouldn't the American people be a lot better off, Mr. President, if Homeland Security were left to focus on violent criminals and enforcing the border, not on kids accused of non-violent crimes? I assume no one here really thinks that mandatorily incarcerating children accused of nonviolent crimes is the best, most strategic way to fix our immigration system. We certainly don't want a repeat of the images of children caged in chain-linked enclosures screaming out for their parents. Federal law enforcement, Mr. President, does not want a repeat of that, least of all, least of anybody. And I doubt any of us would want private prisons managing that outcome either. That episode was a shameful part of our history. It falls into that chapter of our history. In another one of our more shameful immigration failures, Congress has never addressed the status of the Dreamers. The senator from Alabama made this point when she said that there isn't a Dreamer in the country that's less than 17 years old. That's because, notwithstanding the American people's overwhelming support for Dreamers who know no country other than the United States, that we have been unable to rationalize their presence in the country. But 3 million Dreamers, who after all these years are now middle-aged nurses and teachers and small business owners with families of their own, are also vulnerable. I would ask Senator, the presiding officer, for 2 additional minutes.
Is there objection?
Thank you.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. We can make this bill better and stronger by focusing on the actual threats to public safety and protecting nonviolent kids from getting locked up, stripped away from their parents, schools, churches, and communities. We can make this bill better by protecting nonviolent Dreamers from mandatory incarceration in the only country that they know. Mr. President, I know my time is almost over. The American people want us to fix our broken immigration system. They want us to feel safe in our own country. They want us to secure the border and cut down on illegal border crossings. They want us to strengthen rigorous legal pathways to support our economy and attract top talent. They want us to improve our partnerships with other countries so there's a reason for people to stay at home and not just come here. And as we fix our broken immigration system, most Americans want people treated with dignity, especially if they are children. Immigration is one of the many challenges facing our country today. It touches every aspect of our economy. It directly affects families and often implicates our core values. In their best moments, our parents and grandparents managed to navigate these tough issues by upholding the law and honoring our values. We must not abandon that aspiration in our time. Mr. President, I am grateful for your patience. I apologize for going over a minute or two, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Alabama.
I ask unanimous consent that Senator Ernst, Riss, Shaheen, and I be permitted to speak for up to 5 minutes each prior to the scheduled roll call votes.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, before I yield the floor to my distinguished colleague from Iowa, I do want to respond to one thing my colleague from Colorado said. Look, I'm glad to see there being a keen interest on what's happening to migrant children now. My question has been, where has that passion been for the last 4 years? When we had over 468,000 unaccompanied minors come across our border. When I just saw my distinguished colleague from Wisconsin walk in, who's tried to bring attention to this, tried to make sure that we had a hearing of the 88,000 plus children that have been lost under this previous administration. Look, additionally, when you talk about ICE, there are 6,000 ICE officers on the interior of our country. When we have over 11,000 migrants that have come here illegally, over 7.8 that are actually in removal proceedings, over 1.4 million that have been given their final orders of removal, and yet the resources have not been there for them to do that at the level they need. That will change, Mr. President, under this administration and under the Republican majority. I now yield the floor to my colleague from Iowa.